They had it all, money and fame.
He was making $600 or $700 a year. She was a darling of the press.
And her murder made headlines.
They just blood all around the place.
She put up quite a struggle.
The vicious attack leaves a bloody trail, but where will it end?
He pursued her. He was surveilling her.
They're going to extremes to prevent anyone from knowing where they were.
We had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Sarasota, Florida, November 7th, 1997. It's a sunny autumn day in the wealthy seaside town that's home to many snowbirds and retirees. But at 4:20 that Friday afternoon, the city's 911 dispatch center receives a distressing call.
This is the 911 center. What's the matter? Mom. Oh my God. My mom is dead.
Okay, what makes you think that?
There's blood all around the place.
Okay, who else is in the house there?
I have my brothers and sisters.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
This is a teenage girl who's just gotten home from school, and she finds her mother on the kitchen floor, dead.
The daughter had come home from school, and the brothers and sister were wandering around crying, and she found her mother.
Is the person that did this to her still there?
Oh, I don't think
so. Okay. Calm down. We have help on the way.
I was dispatched as the primary unit to respond to the house. And it took me a few minutes to get there, but I ended up going in first.
Inside, police find 13-year-old Stevie Bellish in the kitchen.
She was standing over her mother, who was on the floor. Obvious blood, gunshot wound in the face. She'd been there for a little while. There's definitely no signs of life.
4 small children, bloody and distraught, but apparently unhurt, are also in the room.
First thing that we want to do is clear the residence. I had Stevie go outside and start bringing her siblings outside.
Once the children are outside, police clear the rest of the house.
I started going room to room, making sure that there was no other victims or any of the suspects. Looking under the beds, just looking for anybody that's there to do harm or other victims. Unfortunately, there was none.
The scene secured. Paramedics rush into the kitchen.
Scenes like this, it's pretty tough to forget. It is readily apparent that there was nothing that we were going to be able to do for her.
Stevie Bellish identifies the victim as her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish. Sheila Lee Walsh was born in 1962 in Topeka, Kansas, to an Air Force pilot father and stay-at-home mom.
She lost her father when she was 10. He was shot down in a mission in Vietnam. Sheila's father was more than a role model to her. He was her hero, and she wanted to make him proud. She graduated high school in 1982 and started a job as a receptionist at a local law firm. And that's where she met her future husband, Alan Van Hout. It was kind of a whirlwind romance. He proposed to her on their third date, and 3 months later, they were married.
Alan soon became a successful businessman, the owner of a medical supply company in Bend, Oregon.
He had made a lot of money. I believe he was making $600 or $700 a year on that medical equipment business.
Now multi-millionaires, the couple relocated to Hawaii and then to San Antonio, Texas.
Alan actually told me, man, one of the most beautiful times he had was living in Hawaii for 2 years. He actually owned a yacht. He said Hawaii is very expensive, but he loved it. That's like the best place in the world to live.
Somewhere in that same time frame, he changed his name to Alan Blackthorne.
He was just like a playboy. He got money, I think he might have had a 911 Porsche.
In the mid-1980s, the Playboy became a family man. He and Sheila had 2 daughters, but the marriage didn't last.
Everything seemed like it was wonderful until kids come, a lot of stress come, a lot of different moves people make, they not going in the same direction. I mean, hey, that's why things get dissolved.
There had been a divorce. There had been litigation. There had been child support issues.
Sheila eventually received full custody of her 2 daughters. And in 1992, the single mom fell in love with a pharmaceutical salesman named Jamie Bellish. A year later, the couple married.
They really wanted the family. They had some difficulty getting pregnant, so they decided to try IVF treatment, and it ended up working a little too well.
In December 1995, Sheila gave birth to 3 sons and a daughter, and local media dubbed her the Quad Mom.
When she gave birth to the quads, it was a big media event here in San Antonio.
She was kind of a celebrity.
She was a darling of the press. It made a lot of news.
In 1997, the family of 8 relocated to Sarasota, Florida to start a new life.
He got a promotion in the Sarasota, Florida area, and they packed up and moved.
But for Sheila Bellish, it was the beginning of the end. On November 7th, just 6 weeks after leaving Texas, the 35-year-old mother of 6 is found dead in her home, surrounded by her 4 youngest children.
None of them appeared injured, but they did have some blood on them. There was blood on their feet, it was on their hands. Some of them, I recall, it was on their the life vests that they were wearing.
We wondered why the children were in life jackets. It did look like they might have been out by the pool at some point, but we didn't know when or what time that might have occurred. It doesn't appear from the blood spatter that the children were close when this happened. It appears more like the children came to find their mother and were walking around her after she had passed.
Investigators want to know who could do something as horrible as killing a mother while her young children are in the house.
What's the motive? What is the possible motive for anyone to do what they did to her?
Coming up, police take a closer look at Sheila and Jamie's marriage.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle, which would be her current husband.
On November 7th, 1997, police find mother of 6, Sheila Bellish, murdered inside her Florida home. The brutality of the crime shocks even the most seasoned investigators.
This was clearly a homicide. She had her throat cut, had a bullet hole in her cheek.
She had some defensive wounds on her hands and arms.
She put up quite a struggle, and to me, that's a mother's instinct. She had those kids there with her, and she was thinking of her kids.
The trail of blood leading from the kitchen suggests the attacks started elsewhere.
Despite severe and ultimately lethal wounds, she actually crawled down a hallway from a utility room.
From where the initial attack had taken place to where Sheila eventually passed away, it was approximately 17 feet.
There were blood splatter marks on the baseboard and somewhat up the wall, every few feet. What was happening was she was crawling to get to the phone, and she was collapsing. She'd lost so much blood and was losing blood. She'd collapse every foot or so, and she'd smack on the floor, and it would throw blood up on the wall.
She'd managed to get to the phone and get it off the receiver, off the hook, but she was never able to dial 911. It was an old rotary phone, so anybody who remembers the old rotary phones knows that dialing the 9 is the longest time it takes to dial. And I always did wonder if it had been a push-button phone, if she might have been able to at least get 911 pressed.
Investigators find no sign of forced entry, but the door between the utility room and the garage is open.
It's believed that that door had been unlocked.
In the utility room off the garage, evidence techs find a bloody knife on the floor.
It appeared to be a match to a set of knives that was located in the kitchen on a magnetic rack. The knife had approximately a 7-inch blade.
Investigators also find a .45 caliber shell casing and a bullet hole in the wall.
The shell casing was located in the utility room on top of the washer and dryer.
Since it appears to be where the shooting occurred, crime scene investigators pay special attention to the utility room when processing the house for clues.
We knew for a fact that the suspect had been in those areas. And we did develop a fingerprint on the side of the dryer. They all get submitted to the latent print division of the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office.
But the results will take time.
In 1997, we were doing most of our latent print comparison manually, which meant a human would sit there and do a one-to-one comparison. So it's impossible to just go through the fingerprint files and start doing comparisons like they do now.
Police are also canvassing the neighborhood looking for additional leads.
The neighborhood they lived in was a quiet neighborhood. Most people were retired. Back then, we probably had 5 or 6 homicides a year in Sarasota County. But it wasn't something that would happen in that neighborhood ever. So when it did happen, people were like, everybody talked about it.
Several witnesses did report having seen a man walk around in camouflage clothing and combat boots in the neighborhood, which they seemed to think was unusual.
Finally, investigators turn to Sheila's daughter, Stevie, but the distraught teen has little to give them.
She was the first one to arrive home from school, and she saw her mother laying on the floor, and she made the 911 call.
After talking to a shaken Stevie, investigators turn their attention to the teen's stepfather, who they'll need to eliminate as a suspect.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle and work your way outward. So we initially had to start with her current husband, which is Jamie Bellish. And we looked into where he was that day.
He was interviewed by some sheriff's deputies in Sarasota. He was absolutely heartbroken and devastated.
He told us where he was. He was a salesman for pharmaceuticals, so he had different places that he had been that day.
Jamie said he left the house around 7:30 a.m. He stopped and had breakfast, and then he went to Fort Myers to meet with some clients. He left there around 3 p.m., went to meet with a contractor who was working on the new house.
We were able to later, shortly thereafter, verify everywhere he was.
They quickly concluded he had no involvement in it.
However, when investigators ask who might have reason to hurt Sheila, Jamie Bellish suggests that her ex, Alan Blackthorne, might have something to do with Sheila's death.
They had a very rocky marriage. She filed for divorce. He very much resented it, and they fought constantly for at least 10 years.
Jamie says it got so bad that they decided to move away from Texas.
She wanted to get out of Texas because he was always taking her in and out of court, trying to get custody of the kids, and she had about enough of it. So she left Texas and didn't let him know where she was.
I think it was only Sheila's sister that knew where she was, and 1 or 2 very close friends who fully understood that they were not to tell anyone.
Coming up, did the family's disappearance push Alan Blackthorne over the edge?
He had lost, and it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
In Sarasota, Florida, police investigating the murder of Sheila Bellish have identified a possible suspect, her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
They had been fighting back and forth for, could be close to a decade, from the time of the divorce until 1997. And he would file motions for custody or to reduce child support, and She would file motions to restrict his ability to visit his children. She would file motions to increase child support. It went on and on and on and on.
In early 1997, Alan Blackthorne abruptly surrendered.
He shows up and tells his lawyer that he wants to abandon all rights to the children. He wants to surrender his parental rights. He signed essentially documents giving up any parental rights to his children. And that was a loss. That was a big loss.
While Sheila and Jamie were happy to finally have full legal custody, the fear that her ex had another plan up his sleeve still kept Sheila up at night.
Sheila was a nervous wreck.
And Alan being a very wealthy guy, and she was afraid of him.
He had lost. As we spoke with witnesses, it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
Jamie and Sheila had quietly relocated the family to Florida.
Jamie was a pharmaceutical representative, and his company agreed to let him move his territory, and they saw an attorney to learn how to purchase that house without being a matter of public record. They were going almost to extremes to prevent anyone publicly from knowing where they were.
Despite their precautions, had Alan managed to locate his ex-wife?
Police contacted airlines and car rental companies to see if Blackthorne had been in the area recently, but they didn't come up with anything.
Placing him in Florida was a long shot at that point.
Sarasota investigators also reach out to authorities in Texas, who contact Blackthorne at his home in San Antonio on November 8, 1997.
He claims he had nothing to do with Sheila's murder, and he just found out about it on the news. Police said he didn't seem like he was trying to hide anything.
We found pretty soon that he was in Texas and couldn't have committed this crime.
But if Alan Blackthorne didn't kill Sheila, who did? Over the next 24 hours, investigators pieced together a series of clues.
They were canvassing the area, and they found an employee at a gas station who remembered a man coming in and asking for directions. The address that he was asking for was Mark Ridge, which is the neighborhood where Sheila lived. They also spoke with a neighbor who said they saw something strange around 9:15 a.m. on the day Sheila was killed.
There was a guy that happened to see a strange vehicle in the neighborhood.
The driver was a young man wearing camouflage.
This is a retirement community. Why would anybody be wearing camouflage outfit, combat boots in this neighborhood?
The witness doesn't know the stranger's identity, but he may be able to help investigators find the suspicious car.
He was able to actually give us a tag number, which was a huge break. And we did run that tag in Florida and got nothing, but we knew that they had just moved from Texas, and we ran that tag out of Texas, and it came back.
The vehicle is registered to a woman living in La Pryor, Texas, which is a small town just southwest of San Antonio. When police contacted the owner, she said her grandson was the person who primarily used the car, and his name was Jose Del Toro.
After a little digging, detectives learned that Del Toro is a small-time criminal from San Antonio.
He's in a work release program after a theft conviction, but he didn't show up that weekend.
We needed to talk to him. And in the meantime, Texas Rangers had located his vehicle and were sitting on it. We kind of thought there'd be a lot of valuable evidence in the car, but we needed some evidence to get a search warrant.
While Texas Rangers watched Del Toro's car, investigators in Sarasota contact local hotels, searching for evidence he'd been in the area.
They got a hit on the name at a hotel just a few miles away from the crime scene. Guest records show Del Toro stayed there on November 6th, the night before the murder.
He did use his own driver's license for ID.
Then, hoping to place Del Toro at the scene of the crime, investigators request a copy of his fingerprints from authorities in Texas.
The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office completed a one-to-one comparison of the prints from Jose Del Toro to the latent print that was lifted from the utility room, and they determined that it was a match to Jose Del Toro.
When we got that fingerprint hit, that was enough to get us a search warrant. And then when we did a search warrant on his car, we found the murder weapon. We found the receipt for the camouflage clothing that he bought right down the street from the crime scene. So we had a ton of evidence on him.
Coming up, investigators are convinced that they've found Sheila's killer. But they'll soon be wondering, was he acting alone?
When the conspiracy theory came out, then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Investigators in Florida have identified a prime suspect for the murder of Sheila Bellish, a small-time criminal from San Antonio, Texas, named Jose Del Toro.
We had his fingerprints at the crime scene.
Searching Del Toro's car, investigators also found the murder weapon and a receipt for the camouflage clothing witnesses described.
His vehicle was parked outside of one of his girlfriend's house down in San Antonio.
The girlfriend said she didn't know anything about Sheila's murder. She said Del Toro told her he was headed to Miami to make a drug deal. But she said if Del Toro was involved, his cousin Sammy would know about it.
Del Toro is still on the run, but on November 12, 1997, Texas Rangers locate his cousin, Samuel Gonzalez, and bring him in for questioning.
Tell me what you know about this incident.
Supposed to be just a beating and nothing about the killing was supposed to be occurred. And got to the point when I heard about that and saw the news and was kind of sad about it and disgusted about it.
Gonzalez tells investigators that his friend Danny Rocha had approached him a few months earlier with a job offer.
That's when the conspiracy theory came out, and then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
He told us that he was asked to beat up Sheila, and he said, "I can't hit a woman."
Danny started talking about the money involved and said it could be as much as $10,000. And Sammy said he thought his cousin might be interested. His cousin was Joy Del Toro.
Those two traveled to the Bellish residence in Bernie, Texas. Timing was good for her. She got away.
They looked in the windows, and there was just very little bit of furniture. And so they reported to Rocha that it looked like no one was living there.
Heard she had just moved out of States.
Gonzalez says Rocha had reached out to him again on November 5th with a new address for Sheila Bellish in Sarasota, Florida, and that he'd passed the information along to Del Toro.
Okay, so he's supposed to get down to Florida, punch her, and that's it. All right, what happens next?
Sammy claims that Del Toro came back on November 8th and told him that he had fired a gun at Sheila.
He said he shot her, but he didn't know if he hit her or not, and so I didn't didn't want to hear about it. So.
He said he shot at her, but didn't know if he hit her?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
you mention anything about cutting her?
No, he didn't.
According to Gonzalez, killing Sheila wasn't explicitly part of the plan, but that he wasn't surprised it happened.
Danny had asked Joey to beat her up in a way that she was not able to take care of the kids. But he said that the best way to do it, just if you want to use 10 grand, is to kill her.
But when investigators ask Gonzalez if he knows where they can find Del Toro, he tells them that Sheila's killer has already fled to Mexico.
Joey is told by someone who had spoken to his grandmother that the police were looking for him, and he was wanted in connection with the murder of a woman in Sarasota. So he takes a bus to the border and walks across the border, and you know he's gone.
With Del Toro on the run, investigators focus on the men who allegedly hired him, and the man they suspect is behind it all, Alan Blackthorne.
Why would Danny Rocha? Why would Sammy Gonzalez? Why would Del Toro put a hit on Sheila in Florida? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. But if Mr. Blackthorne comes into the picture, it makes all the sense in the world.
Talking to associates of both Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha, investigators soon established that there is a connection between the two men.
Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha's relationship, everybody knew about it. They were big-ass golf buddies.
Danny Rocha was a very good golfer, not PGA quality, but he was a very good amateur golfer. And he gambled.
He was a golf hustler, and he would play golf with Alan Blackthorne and make a lot of money because he usually would win.
The bets were sometimes $1,000 a hole.
But we needed to get Danny Rocha to get to Alan Blackthorne.
Investigators suspect that Blackthorne had also offered Rocha 10 times that amount to get rid of his ex-wife.
It all came back pointing towards Alan Blackthorne.
Sammy Gonzalez's statement gives the authorities enough evidence to take the golf hustler into custody for conspiracy to commit murder on November 17th.
The Texas Rangers actually went to his house and arrested him, brought him to jail in San Antonio, and then we extradited him back to Sarasota.
Getting him to talk isn't as easy.
I sat in on some of the debriefings of Sammy and Danny, which could be brutally difficult.
We didn't get much from him.
Rocha refuses to flip on Blackthorne, but will the investigation be stalled for long?
November 20th, investigators find out that Del Toro's been arrested in Monterrey, Mexico.
Then we had to try to get him back from Mexico. And that turned into a political circus because at the time, Mexico would not let you extradite anybody out of there if you had a death sentence on the table.
Coming up, with Mexico being a possible dead end, investigators try a different approach and hit a new roadblock.
So I said, "You're going to get life in prison." And he said, "I'll roll the dice."
By mid-December of 1997, 1 month after the brutal murder of Sheila Bellish, authorities believe they are close to unraveling the conspiracy that led to her death. Suspected triggerman Jose Del Toro is in a Mexican jail, awaiting extradition.
All the politicians had to get involved and try to work out those details.
Samuel Gonzalez has already agreed to a plea deal for his role in the plot.
Sammy was just a big teddy bear. I don't think he would even get in a fist fight, so I think he got used in the whole process, to be honest with you. But he did get the best deal because he cooperated.
Alleged middleman Danny Rocha has refused to cooperate, but on December 16th, prosecutors charge him with criminal solicitation to commit capital murder and pressure him to turn on Sheila's ex, Alan Blackthorne, the alleged mastermind behind the murder.
I went to the jail and I interviewed him several times because we really wanted Blackthorne.
Eventually, between the jail interviews and statements Rocha makes to the media, investigators piece together what happened.
Danny was looking for some money, and he had some ideas in his head about how he might be able to start a business or whatever with Mr. Blackthorne. And Mr. Blackthorne started talking about Sheila and started talking about how bad of a person she was, how bad of a parent she was, and verbalizing that he would like to see something happen to her. He'd like to see her beat up and asking Danny about it.
Danny, in addition to making money, a lot of money, gambling on golf with Blackthorne, was a bookie. So apparently Alan thought that he had connections with unsavory underworld type people, but he really didn't. And so Danny asked Sam Gonzalez if he would get involved in having this ex-wife beaten up.
Before they could do it, Sheila and her family moved to Florida, which just made Alan even angrier.
Alan Blackthorne can't lose. No matter what he has to do, he's going to win. He had the mentality that he's rich and he's not going to lose his kids to anybody.
He hires a private detective to track Sheila down.
When she moved to Florida, he pursued her there. He was surveilling her. He was following her.
As soon as the private detective located Sheila, Blackthorne had gone back to Danny Rocha.
Blackthorne told Rocha that there'll be $50,000 in it if I get my children back. And Danny says, she'd have to be hurt pretty badly for you to get the children. And he said, that's fine. That conversation was repeated a couple of times. One time, Blackthorne said to him, look, the best way for them to do this is to kill her and dump her in the ocean or bury her in the woods.
One time, he made a statement. He wanted her thrown to the alligators.
With new marching orders from Blackthorne, Danny Rocha alerted Sammy Gonzalez, who contacted Jose Del Toro and set the whole plan in motion.
Del Toro drove basically straight through to Sarasota. He also, during that time, made dozens of phone calls on his cell phone.
He was a good-looking kid. He had a lot of girlfriends. He was on the phone with one or more of them throughout the trip. So that way we sent a subpoena to whatever cell phone company Del Toro was using for his cell phone. And using repeating towers, we were able to show the entire trip.
After Joey Del Toro butchered Sheila, Danny goes over to Blackthorne's house. And Danny says, yeah, they did it. I need some money to give to Del Toro, and I need $10,000. Blackthorne said, you guys fucked up. Because he had already heard that she had been found in her house. He knew before Rocha got there that Sheila had been killed. And she was found in the kitchen of her house. And he had instructed them to bury her in the woods or dump her in the ocean.
Despite being stiffed by Blackthorne, Rocha refuses to testify in court against his old golfing buddy.
The state of Florida, the Sarasota County District Attorney, was trying to coordinate with the Bexar County, Texas DA to work out a deal. They can't work it out. And his case went to trial.
So I said, you're going to get life in prison. And he said, I'll roll the dice.
When he goes on trial in January of 1999, the jury finds Danny Rocha guilty of first-degree murder. He's sentenced to life in prison.
Danny Rocha got exactly what he deserves. I think he'll die in prison.
However, Rocha's refusal to testify against him means that Alan Blackthorne remains free.
I think his wealth, maybe that gave him a sense of invincibility. He was out there after the murder and on like the evening news once in a while.
Blackthorne was so arrogant, it was irritating or aggravating. And he accused Jamie Bellish of being the cause, if not the actual murderer in the case. And frankly, it pissed us off.
Determined to get Blackthorne, investigators continue working the case. And in July of '99, make a major breakthrough.
Mexico agrees to extradite Del Toro and return him to Florida.
Coming up, with Del Toro's plea, only the alleged mastermind behind the murder remains at large. But will Alan Blackthorne ever face justice?
Sometimes if you got money, you can get away with substantial things.
In July of 1999, Florida authorities have finally apprehended the man who killed Sheila Bellish. 24-year-old Jose Del Toro.
He certainly wasn't a professional. He got into something way over his head.
After pleading guilty to Sheila's murder, Del Toro gives investigators a detailed confession.
What happened is that Jose Del Toro sat in the garage area for a bit until he felt comfortable enough to come into the house.
He was in the house for like an hour watching her, and he said he was getting ready to leave because he didn't want to do it, and she noticed him. When their eyes met, he panicked, and he said it was too late then. He had to go do what he had to
do. Del Toro's confession also implicates the man investigators believe is the mastermind behind Sheila's murder. Her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
He talked about how Blackthorne told him what a bad woman she was.
But even with Del Toro's confession, Blackthorne will be difficult to prosecute.
Texas has a code of criminal procedure. You cannot get a conviction based on an accomplice's testimony unless that is corroborated and links the defendant to the crime. And they tried every way they could to find that corroboration, but they were having trouble finding it. As time went on, it became more and more clear that they had a problem doing that, and that they might not ever get a conviction in state court, and that the proper venue for it would be federal court.
Prosecutors down in Texas, federal prosecutors, decided that there was a federal crime, planning a crime across state lines.
On January 4th, 2000, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Western Texas issues an arrest warrant for Alan Blackthorne.
Blackthorne was arrested in the parking lot of his country club.
We put him in the car, advised him of his rights, and then we took him down to the FBI office for being processed.
In June of 2000, Blackthorne finally stands trial for the murder of his ex-wife.
He was very cocky at the trial and was doing interviews with the press every day and thought it was a big joke. And he thought he was going to walk on this thing. But the two federal prosecutors were great. They did their homework.
The circumstantial evidence in this case was very, very strong. Mr. Blackthorne was a very controlling man. He was a man that was very angry about this divorce. He was very angry about the custody of his children. He was obsessed about it.
She eventually prevailed, moved away. He couldn't control her anymore. And that was a good part of our proof, good meaning large part of our proof at the trial to demonstrate why he would go to the trouble to have her killed.
Prosecutors also put the other members of the conspiracy on the stand, including Blackthorne's old golfing buddy Danny Rocha, who finally agrees to testify.
They were the witnesses that were going to make or break this case. If they were believed, we had a solid shot at obtaining a conviction and gaining justice. Their information had to be corroborated in state court, but it just had to be believed in federal court.
Will the jury believe them? On July 6th, 2000, they announced their decision.
The jury came back with guilty verdicts to both counts in the indictment.
It's taken almost 3 years, but the man most responsible for Sheila Bellish's death has finally been brought to justice.
But justice is an imperfect thing. Mr. Bellish will never get Sheila back. Sheila's gone forever. The kids had to live through this horrible nightmare.
But then you think about the emotional trauma of 4 children walking around their mother in the blood.
And then poor Stevie, 13 years old, came home from school and found her mother. It's heartbreaking. The damage and heartbreak that he caused all those people.
A tragedy like this is never forgotten. Jamie will never forget it, and the kids will, although they were quite young and won't remember it, they'll know of it, and they'll know what happened to their mother.
She was a great lady and a great mother. A lot of times, people that get murdered have a lot to do with why they got murdered. In this case, she did nothing. She was the most innocent victim you could find.
They were high school sweethearts building a better life together.
My dad was a father that you would just dream of having. Same thing with my mom.
We decided, we're going to buy a home. And this one in Calypso Lane, we kept coming back to it.
Until a neighborhood dispute spiraled out of control.
This is trespassing. You're going to jail for that, asshole.
It was a testosterone fight that just wouldn't stop. And it just got worse and worse.
And when the battle leaves one of them dead, police must determine whether it was justified or a final act of revenge.
People are screaming, "The shooter's in the house!"
We should not be afraid of being killed by our neighbors.
On September 24th, 2011, it's a quiet evening in the bedroom community of Canyon Country, California, until the sheriff's office receives an alarming call around 3 a.m.
911? Yes, my neighbor. Somebody got shot. Do you know who was shot? I don't know their names. I heard 2 shots and then ran up there.
Deputies arrive minutes later to find a chaotic scene.
There's a crowd of neighbors. They're in their pajamas. Everybody's screaming, yelling. There's chaos.
People are screaming, "The shooter's in the house! The shooter's in the house!" They're pointing and yelling at this house.
The arriving deputy sheriffs didn't know what was going on. They perceived a person that had been shot laying very close to the front door.
They were told that the suspect was armed and was still inside the house. Some of the neighbors were hysterical.
Realizing how dangerous the situation is, the officers immediately call for backup and secure the area.
They were trying to figure out who the victim was, where the shots had come from, and what to do about it. This was about one of the most bizarre, frightening experiences they had had. They still had a potential active shooting situation. Their policy and protocol was not to let in treating paramedics.
They'll stage, but they will not come to the scene until law enforcement tells them that it's safe.
The victim needed to be moved out of a potential kill zone onto the driveway, so the people that were administering aid helped drag him to what they believed to be a safer area.
While medics try to stabilize the victim, arriving officers learn the shooter is believed to be in the house and set up a perimeter.
They had their guns drawn, and they were ready to shoot anybody that opened the front door.
By this time, law enforcement has been able to identify the victim on the ground.
There's a man bleeding out. His wife is there. She tells police, "This is my husband. This is Tony Davis."
Raised in Glendale, California, Anthony Davis was instilled with a blue-collar work ethic from an early age.
Tony learned roofing when he was in high school. He was a roofer. And he ran his own little business for a while.
High school is also where he'd meet the love of his life, Cindy.
I was 15 and Tony was 16. I used to ride my horse up through town, and I guess I caught his attention. There was one day I was walking, and I hear him come out, and I knew that boy liked me. And that's where it started.
It would take 11 years and 2 children for Tony and Cindy to make it official.
We first moved in together when I was 17 and Tony was 18, I believe. I worked in retail for a while, then went on to office management. So, started having babies at age 20. My son was my firstborn, and then my daughter 4 years later.
And we were just all a tight-knit family.
Tony and Cindy worked hard to provide for their family, and Tony moved on from working as a roofer to become a truck driver. But in 1991, tragedy struck.
At 35, he decided he was going to go and get his CDL and drive a truck. He did okay there, but he had an accident during those years and he about lost his leg. He had a crush injury is what he had.
It was a really, really serious injury that caused him to have to undergo several surgeries.
After the wreck, it took 5 years for Tony to recover well enough to walk, but he would never be able to drive a truck again.
Tony was in his late 30s. He had to reinvent himself. He had to provide for his family and put clothing on his children's backs.
Tony enrolled in college at Cal State University Northridge and began a career in teaching. The Davises decided to make another change as well.
2003 is when we decided, we're going to buy a home. Every day when Tony got off work, he would go hunting. And this one in Calypso Lane, we kept coming back to it.
He just said, this is it. And he took my mom up there and it became a dream come true. And when we walked in, my dad said, this is going to be our house.
This was the Davises' dream home. It was the first home that they had bought together as a married couple.
But almost 9 years later, the Davises' neighborhood has become a crime scene after Tony was found shot in front of the house next door. The gunman is believed to be holed up inside, and police have the area surrounded.
The deputy sheriff was trying to make commands for the person inside, or persons, to reveal themselves, to come out of the house, to give up, lay down their weapons.
They're armed and ready, and they have no idea what to expect.
Coming up, as paramedics try to save Tony's life, police come face to face with an assailant.
They're very nervous about what he's going to do.
Because it happened very fast.
"51-year-old Tony Davis has been found shot in his Santa Clarita neighborhood. Police are in a standoff with the gunman, and EMTs are fighting to save Tony's life amidst the active crime scene.
They didn't know what the situation was on the inside of the house, other than at least one person who had a gun who had just shot somebody was on the inside.
But just as officers prepare to storm the house, the door suddenly opens.
The, at this point, alleged shooter acts very bizarrely. He's not coming out. He's not listening to orders to come out. He opens the door and he says, "You come in."
Which they weren't quite sure was an invitation or a threat.
They can see that he's not armed, so they decide to go into the house and they find 2 people inside.
They perceive a male and female in their 50s inside the house.
Police quickly handcuff the couple while they conduct a search of the house.
The first thing that happens is the man, the suspected shooter, complains that his cuffs are too tight. So as one of the deputies is loosening the grip of the cuffs, he blurts out something rather unusual. He says, "This is the first time I've had to discharge my weapon in anger, and I was in the Army."
Once the deputies made entry into the house, they did a protective sweep. They made sure there was no other imminent threat.
In the course of that, they see a shotgun sitting on the couch. Apparently no attempt to try to hide this weapon. There it is.
Officers transport them both to the Santa Clarita Valley Sheriff's Station for questioning. The couple is identified as 51-year-old Lonnie Paul Tracy and his wife Sandra.
They felt that while they sorted things out, the safest course would be to take them back to the station out of potential harm of angry neighbors, etc.
Meanwhile, paramedics outside are trying to keep Tony alive, but his injuries prove to be too severe.
He had a big gaping hole in his chest. I did not see the hole that was in his back until after the coroner arrived and when they turned him over.
They did everything they could to try and save his life, but it was a tough road to hoe.
Tony's family is devastated by the news of his death.
You're in shock. And the only one I wanted was my daughter. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do.
I just had fallen asleep, and I got woken up by my husband. He goes, "Your mom called." There was a voicemail, and it was my mom screaming. And at that point in time, I knew that my dad had died.
While the coroner removes Tony's body for an autopsy, detectives Gene Okada and Gib Anderson are assigned to the case and begin searching the home of the shooter, Lonnie Tracy.
One of the first things they noticed was that the Tracy's home sticks out like a sore thumb. It's kind of an eyesore.
There was a 6-foot-high fence that paralleled the walkway. That was unusual.
It didn't bear any resemblance to most fences. It did have some kind of tactical bearing to it.
It's what law enforcement would call a kill zone, because you're enclosed between the garage and this fence.
An examination of the walkway turns up several pieces of evidence.
I saw 2 shell casings, maybe about 2-3 feet in front of the front door. I saw blood, and I saw the drag marks, so they had pulled into the front of the garage.
They also noticed that the home was outfitted with 4 surveillance cameras and a makeshift security system.
There was an extension cord running from the garage, and it connected by power this infrared light.
The infrared light was on the fence and pointed toward the Davis's home. It seemed intentional.
And inside the Tracy's home, detectives find a small room that appears to be some kind of command center.
In that side room is all this technology for surveillance cameras and stacks and stacks and stacks of tapes and photographs and documents, as if someone from the CIA lived in this home.
He had what I think is commonly known as a splitter, so he could see 4 cameras at once, and there was a monitor that was on.
At this point in an investigation, investigators would typically collect all of the evidence and send it to a forensic lab.
Based on their extreme security measures targeting the Davis family, the Tracys seem to be acting as though the Davises are their mortal enemies. And Cindy Davis tells detectives there's a very good reason why.
As it turns out, there was a lot of bad blood between these 2 families, the Davis family and the Tracy family. And Cindy Davis actually says that she had a feeling that something exactly like this was going to happen.
When I talked to the victim's wife, it was almost like, now what? What's going to happen next? She had her guard up, but she was able to talk and tell us the story that had been happening between her neighbors.
Coming up, investigators learn the details of a vicious rivalry that's been building for years.
Lots of volatility between the 2, things that have been done to each other.
They were 2 peas in a pod. They just couldn't let things go.
Police investigating the death of Tony Davis have learned that the shooting might be the result of an ongoing feud with his neighbor, Lonnie Paul Tracy. According to Cindy Davis, the dispute started a couple of years after they moved into the neighborhood in 2003.
She tells them that they never really liked each other that much, the 2 families, perhaps in the beginning when they were new neighbors. But there was an incident.
Tony's style was easygoing, and we did have an issue when we first moved there about a bowing fence a little bit. And so he went over and he knocked on the neighbor's door, which there was no answer. So he decided to leave a little, I believe it was a Post-it note, and said, "Hi, this is your neighbor. Could you please not lean the tire up against the fence?" I mean, it was a huge tire. It wasn't like a car tire. It was more like a really big semi-tire.
Cindy says the Tracys never moved the tire, but a little while after that, there was an attempted break-in late at night.
There was another incident involving my son. He heard something in the garage, and he had came and woke Tony and I up, and we went out there, and you heard the neighbor's door close. We went in the garage, nothing was missing, but there was definitely somebody there.
And Cindy tells investigators that over the next few years, things only got stranger.
We would come home from work, and there would be citations on our door from animal control stating that our German Shepherds were running wild in the neighborhood. And it would be like, that's not true.
One of the citations claimed that the Davises' dog jumped the fence and tried to bite a child.
But according to Cindy, their dog was not on the property, not outside their own home on the date and time that Mr. Tracy insisted that this happened.
We went down to the animal control and addressed the issue and just said, this isn't true. What do you need me to do? And it's like, who are these people? And they were relentless. And being that there was never no proof, it was basically just dropped.
Once again, Tony tried to talk to Lonnie, but he wouldn't even open the door.
He wasn't like a person you could go and have a conversation with him and ask him, what am I doing that offends you? You know, let's work this out like two grown adults. It wasn't that way. Instead, he would do these crazy things.
Cindy says that by 2007, the citations had gotten out of hand, and Lonnie had started recording their alleged infractions.
Some of those complaints could be something like somebody's lawnmower went 2 feet over the line, a dirt clod was found in the backyard that they wanted held as evidence.
This is trespassing after he's been warned with a court order. He's been told 3 times. His name is Anthony Davis. That's him. That's what he just did. Police are being called. Go call the police.
Our trash cans were in public view, and it is a city ordinance that you shouldn't have trash cans in public view. But if you drive around Santa Clarita, Glendale, LA, you're going to see somebody's trash can. And most people don't care.
But when she and Tony discovered the windshield of their car had been shattered, they decided it was time to fight fire with fire.
They were frankly fed up, and they did fight back at times. There's no doubt about it.
The Santa Clarita Valley Station personnel had many phone calls, letters, etc., with both neighbors making accusations against the others.
That only made matters worse.
Tony had gotten his bachelor's degree, and I decided that we were going to have a little party at our home. So we invited some of his colleagues and some few family members and set the backyard up really nice. And we're out there having a good time. And the next thing I know, Tracy next door picks up his blower and he just starts blowing, and the dirt is just coming over into our yard.
My dad just simply walked over there and asked him, "What are you doing?" And no response, just a blower, and more dust came up. I think Mr. Paul Tracy was trying to antagonize my father, and when he didn't get any type of reaction that he wanted, things progressively got worse.
The final straw came that June, when Cindy says they caught Lonnie taking pictures of them.
My dad and I, we were just sitting on one of the walls in the front yard, and we were just talking. I don't remember what we were talking about, but Mr. Tracy came out and just started taking pictures of us. And my dad just simply looked at me and said, "Jamie, let's go inside."
He had more family photos of Tony and I and my family than I probably ever have. It was just nuts. And so we went and we got a restraining order.
However, the Tracys responded by taking out a restraining order against them.
While Cindy and Tony Davis were a united front in their allegations against the Tracys, So were the Tracys in their allegations against the Davises.
All they did was take the same words that Tony and I put and put their name on it, word for word.
Instead of putting an end to the hostilities, the restraining orders only added fuel to the fire. But no one could have known how hot it would get.
It just festered. Just like any feud, it gets getting worse and worse.
Coming up, the battle between the Tracys and the Davises finally explodes.
Neither of these men had the emotional tools to say, wait a minute, this is insane.
Investigators in Santa Clarita, California, are learning about the volatile feud that may have caused 51-year-old Lonnie Tracy to shoot his neighbor, Tony Davis.
The guys had petty complaints back and forth. Primarily, that's the ones that were keeping this feud alive. And this had gone on, I was kind of shocked to learn, for probably at least 7 years.
So what you have here, besides a failure to communicate, is you have essentially grown men acting like 7-year-olds.
Despite restraining orders against both families, the feud only continued to intensify.
There was an increasing escalation between one side and the other. It was sometimes bizarre.
Get the fuck off of our property.
I'm not on the property, I'm on the sidewalk.
You're a fucking maniac.
Just call the police.
On another occasion, Cindy was gardening. She puts her keys up on a fence on a hook. She returns to get the keys. They're not there.
I'm looking in the flower bushes, running around thinking, what'd I do with these keys, knowing darn well I'd put them where I'd put them.
The next day, Cindy discovered someone had vandalized her car. Certain it was the Tracys, Cindy tried filing another report with the sheriff's department.
Unless you have proof, law enforcement can't get involved in something like, I think he did it.
Just like it happened with the restraining order, this caused a flurry of reports in response. Every time the Davises tried to report something to police in their own defense, Tracy's fired back with their own report.
Some of those were like vandalizing cars, scratching cars, changing their location of the mailbox simply to hassle the other person's parking, those kinds of things.
It almost made it seem like the Tracys just sat around thinking of ways to get back at the Davis family. It made it seem as if they were mean, angry people.
Cindy tells police that by early 2011, she and Tony had decided the only way to stop Lonnie Tracy was to catch him in the act.
The Davis family, because they felt that they had been victimized over and over again, decided to do something about it, and so they installed pretty state-of-the-art surveillance around the entire perimeter of their house.
Once again, he just one-ups them and installs his own surveillance cameras. It's almost like anything you can do, I can do better.
Add to that, he's placed flood lamps all around his house, which are aimed right in Tony Davis's and Cindy Davis's bedroom.
Cindy says that's when their dispute took a bizarre turn.
Lonnie Tracy had a bunch of really bizarre posters made and intentionally put them where the Davises couldn't help but see them.
He writes on these posters the most rude, obscene, lewd, vile, and absolutely imbecilic statements about Tony Davis that you can imagine.
If you want to see a whale, if the tours start tomorrow. I mean, it was terrible.
It was a little disturbing that someone would take the time to do that.
Still, the Davises tried to keep the peace. But when Lonnie installed his infrared light, Tony finally decided enough was enough.
Even though the infrared light couldn't be seen with the naked eye, it actually did disrupt the Davises' camera signals. That's exactly why Tony Davis went to his neighbor's house 3 a.m. the night of the shooting.
I'd fallen asleep watching soap operas, and he had went into the security cameras and noticed that one was being blocked out, and he had woke me up and said, "Cindy, I'm going to go next door and just ask him to turn off the lights." I just said, okay.
She didn't know what he meant by that, and then she went back to sleep.
A few minutes later, Cindy would be awakened once again, this time by 2 gunshots.
When she realized that her husband was not in the house, she ran out, went immediately to the Tracy's front yard.
Cindy saw her husband laying within the perimeter of the L-shaped fence. He had been shot, he was crying, and he was still alive.
I went to go to Tony, and the door flung open, and the man pointed the shotgun at me and told me to get the fuck off his property.
She ran back, dialed 911. She was hysterical at this time.
Cindy agrees to hand over all of the surveillance video they recorded that night. Investigators are hopeful it will give them a clearer picture of exactly what happened.
Now that detectives have heard Cindy's side of the story, they head back to the station to get more information from the Tracys.
Coming up, cold-blooded murder or justifiable self-defense.
She said the next-door neighbors were the neighbors from hell.
I've never lived next to such horrible beings in my life.
Cindy Davis has told police about an alarming feud that left her husband Tony dead. Now it's time for them to talk to the shooter, Lonnie Tracy, and his wife, Sandra. 9 hours after the shooting, detectives sit down with Sandra Tracy to get her side of the story.
According to her, they weren't the ones harassing the Davises. It was the other way around.
I've just called them the neighbors from hell forever.
But as much as the two families hated each other, they seemed to have a few things in common.
Lonnie was once employed as a commercial artist, and then he had a very, very serious accident.
He crashed into a sign with his knee and tore the meniscus. We've been living in workers' compensation hell for the last 9 years.
By all rights, they should have been best friends. They were living right next to each other. They were similarly aged. They both had had devastating workplace injury where they were on long-term workers' comp off of work with their days open.
Sandra had many of the same complaints that Cindy did, except in her version, it was the Davises who were the instigators.
She said they erected that fence in front of their house so that people from the street couldn't look into their bedroom.
Sandra tells investigators that when the Davises installed cameras to watch them, they had no choice but to respond in kind.
They had to put up their own surveillance systems to counteract the neighbors' surveillance system. The feud was back and forth, the petty things that they did to each other.
Sandra claims Tony Davis became increasingly volatile, leading to an incident in April of that year.
Lonnie had filed a police report claiming that Tony assaulted him while he was mowing the front lawn.
And then all of a sudden he'd feel something hit him on the head and shoulders, and he was throwing things at him. He just picked up mounds of dirt that had rocks and crap in it, and he was spraying my husband with the hose.
There you go again, folks. There's a fucking water hose right there.
Mr. Tracy thought that constituted assault and battery, and the DA had declined to prosecute.
From that time on, April, Davis has been very emboldened that he can get away with anything. And just more and more stuff started happening. I've been very afraid of this man. I've told the police this for years.
But when it comes to the shooting, Sandra tells investigators she didn't actually see it happen.
Sandra's story was she was sleeping And she knows that her husband is also a night owl, and he was probably tinkering around in his room with model cars.
I had gone in to go to the bathroom. All of a sudden, he's screaming at me, "Call the police! Call the police!" I said, "What's happening?" He said, "Somebody's out here. I'm hearing sounds. There's lights."
She runs back into the bedroom to call police and describes what she hears as a loud banging.
Like either a pounding or something hit the door with a lot of force. A lot of force. It was very loud.
And then what happened next?
I hear shots. And I'm going, "Oh my God, what's happening? What's happening?"
Her husband told her that someone was trying to break into her house, to the front door.
She immediately calls 911, and she's still on the phone with them when Lonnie starts screaming that he's shot the prowler.
She was not aware initially that it was, in fact, Mr. Davis.
Detectives aren't sure what to make of Sandra's story.
Was this a legal and case of self-defense, or was this a murder?
Since her statement was that she was in the bedroom, she heard the shots and came out, there was no reason to arrest her, so we let her go.
Unfortunately, her husband isn't as cooperative.
I would rather have an attorney present.
The fact that the deputies came into his home, they detained him at gunpoint. He seemed a little miffed that this is the way he was treated when he felt in his mind that he had acted appropriately.
Since investigators only have 48 hours from the time of arrest to file charges, they're faced with a decision.
We had the murder weapon. We also had Lonnie's statement that this is the first time that he's ever shot a gun in anger since the Army.
He certainly had hate and animus for his next-door neighbor.
After Mr. Tracy declined to speak to us, we directed the deputies to go ahead and book him for the charge of murder.
Police also charged Lonnie with assault for threatening Cindy Davis with a shotgun. Now they needed to make sure they had the evidence to prove it.
They start by going back through all of the complaints that had been filed with the sheriff's department.
It was really unbelievable to see just the volume of petty complaints back and forth over a period of approximately 7 years.
When you see the reports one after another through the years, you could see that it was building to some sort of climactic result or conclusion.
Investigators also pore over the endless hours of surveillance tape both families collected. And what they find is revealing.
In this case, surveillance tape was paramount, and it was the Fort Knox of evidence.
He was following my wife. We've had all kinds of vandalism. There's only one place it comes from. Anthony Davis.
Coming up, Lonnie Tracy takes the stand in his own defense. But will it help his case or hurt it?
You always want somebody to give a statement so you could foresee what they're going to say. Here, I had no idea.
In October of 2012, Lonnie Tracy stands trial for the murder of his neighbor, Tony Davis. The prosecution describes Lonnie as a man whose resentment drove him to do the unthinkable.
He had this pent-up frustration. He was basically homebound. He was in a lot of pain. Unfortunately, the person that he was able to spew his venom at was his neighbor, Mr. Davis.
Prosecutors used physical evidence from the scene, along with a substantial amount of video surveillance evidence to describe what happened the night of the shooting.
The video for the Tracy residence, you saw Mr. Davis arrive. You could see that he was near the L-shaped fence.
Some of it was grainy, but you still get a pretty clear picture, and it looked like he did act to unplug an infrared light that was mounted on the Tracy's wall.
The surveillance tape shows Tony Davis actually walking up to the front door.
Although the cameras didn't pick up the actual shooting, detectives testify that Lonnie could easily see it was Tony through the monitors in his house.
It appeared the final straw in Tracy's mind when Mr. Davis had the gall to come into his yard and disrupt the device that he had put up to disrupt the Davises' video system, and that was more than he could bear.
Detectives believe that Lonnie grabbed his gun with the intention of going to the front door and shooting Tony. And when he shot him, the bullet hit him in the chest.
You can see some haze, which looks like pellets from a shotgun. Then you see Mr. Davis trying to apparently flee as best he could through the front walkway.
They say that's when Lonnie shot Tony in the back, and the medical examiner's report seems to back up that theory.
However, the defense insists that Lonnie was well within his rights to shoot an intruder. And in a surprising move, Lonnie even decides to speak out on his own behalf.
His version was that he heard a noise in the front yard. He took his shotgun to protect himself and his family.
And he can't really make out what's going on because the light's flashing through the windows. And he doesn't know who it is. And no one's ever shown up at his doorstep at 3 a.m.
He testified that he opened the door and that he was bull rushed into the interior of his house.
He ultimately felt that he had to shoot the person. He didn't realize it was his neighbor until later.
Lonnie claims he never threatened Cindy Davis with the gun. She just interpreted it that way.
He told her simply to get off the property and that law enforcement was about to arrive.
He said essentially the same thing about his comment to police, that this was the first time he had shot his weapon since the Army. It's just that they misinterpreted him.
He was simply stating that he had shot his gun, not that he had done it with any malice or anger.
But the prosecution is quick to poke holes in Lonnie's story.
Mr. Tracy didn't even bother to prepare his statement and make sure that it at least was consistent with facts.
All the forensic evidence, the shell casings, the blood, was all discovered outside the home, completely discounts Lonnie Tracy's conviction that he had to fight off this prowler inside his home.
Not only could he have seen Tony on the cameras, Lonnie would have known that it was Tony the second he opened the door.
For him to say that he didn't recognize him was less than truthful.
Prosecutors argued that Lonnie was just waiting for his chance to get Tony, and that night, opportunity presented itself.
Mr. Tracy executed him. He was his own judge, jury, and executioner.
The jury agrees. On November 7th, 2012, they find Lonnie Tracy guilty of first-degree murder.
Mr. Tracy was subsequently sentenced 50 years for the murder and another 14 years for the attempted murder of Mrs. Davis.
What I remember about the trial is what a coward he was. Couldn't look you in the eyes. Never had an ounce of remorse. How it was, he didn't do nothing. It was everybody else's fault.
Justice seems to have been served, but it's cold comfort for the Davis family, whose dreams had been shattered by a simple neighborhood argument.
These two guys that should have been best friends ended up destroying each other's lives. One literally, and the other one is going to be spending the rest of his life in prison. Over what? Nothing.
My father always turned the cheek and was a man of respect. And for what has happened with that man, could never bring back my father, but that man never deserves to be somebody else's neighbor.
Tony's not here physically. And that's pain. That hurts. But he lets us know he's here. So, and that gives you some sort of peace.
He was a gay rights activist devoted to improving the lives of others.
He was able to harness those traumatic experiences that he'd had in his youth.
He trained to be a counsellor and helped other people like him.
Until a 20-year friendship turned into a bizarre feud.
He believed that he was studying the dark arts, that he was involved in Satanism.
Poisoning someone through the air ducts, bugging their surveillance equipment, it just didn't make any sense.
And when their rivalry ends in bloodshed, investigators are left to determine fantasy from reality.
Was it revenge? You've been doing this to me, but look what I'm doing to you? Or was it something more?
Monday, October 30th, 2017. It's a crisp fall afternoon in one of London's most popular neighborhoods, West Kensington.
West Kensington is not the most affluent part of West London, but it's a nice area.
It's quite near places like Earl's Court and Kensington High Street, so it's not the kind of place that you'd normally expect anything particularly bad to happen.
But at 1:45 p.m., something bad does happen when police are called to the scene of a bloody crime.
It was an apartment building on Shaftesbury Place, Warwick Road, and like many other buildings, it needed work, so workmen were there constantly upgrading it.
Two workmen who'd been working on the heating system at the block of flats. The police got a call from these guys to say that a body had been found in one of the apartments.
When the police arrive at the apartment, they're greeted by a gruesome scene. There's the bloodied body of a man, and he's obviously been the victim of a vicious assault, but there's quite bizarre elements to it too.
They found a body laid out on the floor in one of the flats. The body was in a bad way. It had been stabbed and it was covered in a strange white powder that had crystallized.
Homicide detectives arrive soon after to begin an investigation. They have no idea what the white powder is or how it might be linked to the murder, but they are able to determine who the victim is.
The body was found in a flat owned by one Julian Aubrey.
Julian Aubrey was 55 years old and a longtime resident of the apartment building and pretty well known in the community.
We quickly found out that Julian Aubrey had been a counsellor working with victims of abuse, that in his spare time he was an artist.
Why would someone murder a man with such a sterling reputation?
Initially, investigators, I think, didn't quite know what to make of the crime scene. They were confused as to why a man would just be found with so many stab wounds in his own flat in this part of London.
He'd actually been stabbed 22 times. Some of them were deep enough. One went in his heart, I think, and he didn't suffer for long, I was told. What went through his mind for those 2 minutes, say? Dread to think.
Julian Aubrey grew up far away from the busy streets of London, in the town of Rochdale.
Julian's family was him, me, mum, dad, grandparents on both sides, great-grandparents when we were young. He was very close to his family, in particular his maternal grandma.
Growing up, Julian was very sensitive, he was a very gentle child, but he was also very adventurous.
At school, Julian's gentle demeanor often made him a target for bullies.
I remember seeing him in the playground being punched. Don't think he had a great deal of friends, because he was quite solitary.
Like a lot of children who are more sensitive, Julian was driven towards the arts, especially painting. It really gave him a creative outlet.
For the first decade of his life, Julian's upbringing was stable. It was not unusual. But then everything was turned upside down when his parents separated.
After my parents separated, things changed quite dramatically. I was 7, he was 11. Him being 4 years older, understood more, felt more, and he struggled. My mum was in a different relationship by this time, which wasn't a good one, and my brother hated my mum's new partner.
And that wasn't the only thing Julian was struggling with.
Even at a young age, Julian knew he was gay, and he came out to his family during this time.
I was probably 8 when I realised. I don't know how I knew, but just instinctively knew, I suppose. My mum was fine about it. I think she must have known too. I was very proud of him because I knew he had difficulties in that situation.
Around the same time, he also revealed a horrifying truth.
Julian had been sexually abused himself as a child.
Julian was preyed upon in the most awful way by somebody that had a position of trust and authority, somebody who was a member of his church.
An Anglican vicar who was very much affected by that, affected him for the rest of his life, which was an absolute tragedy.
It wasn't until years later, in his 20s, when Julian's abuser was finally brought to justice.
He managed to pluck up the courage to take this person to court at the Old Bailey, and this person was sentenced to a term in prison. Not long enough, I don't think, but nonetheless, he did go. He trained to be a counsellor and helped other people like him, other people who'd been abused sexually. It must have been fantastic therapy for him.
In the late 1990s, Julian moved to London and started a support group for abuse victims in the LGBT community.
I was very proud of that. He was the chairman of it, and he got quite a lot of recognition for it. There were many members. I suppose he thought he was getting somewhere, being recognised, for his hard work.
But for all his success, Julian continued to struggle with his own personal demons.
Julian suffered from bouts of low mood, and he started drinking and taking drugs. He told family members that they made him feel better.
My mum was very worried about him. He convinced himself and tried to convince us that it would be okay.
Of course, it wasn't okay. His drinking and his drug use continued to increase over time. And as it turned out, his family had every reason to fear that the worst would happen.
Had Julian's addictions ultimately led to his murder?
When you start taking drugs, you can get involved with the wrong people. I think that's what happened. Some of his friends were probably doing the same, and a few together, probably just took too much.
Coming up, investigators discover that not everyone in Julian's life thought he was a saint.
Julian had had quite a few problems with neighbours over the last few months.
Why didn't anyone file a police report? Why didn't anybody try to get a restraining order?
London police are investigating the death of 55-year-old Julian Aubrey, a beloved counselor and activist in the LGBT community.
And he did lots of counselling work as well with victims of abuse. So for many people, it was really disturbing to see that he'd been targeted in such a vicious way.
Julian's family were completely shocked by what happened. They had no idea why anyone would want to do that to him.
Julian had been the victim of a brutal and bizarre stabbing.
Unimaginable. He was stabbed. He was obviously covered. I saw one cut to his ear, and it kind of made it a bit more real. Quite shocking, really.
As well as the stab wounds, the body seemed to be covered in a crystallized white substance.
At this point, they don't know what they have on their hands. A drug situation? They're just not sure. So they take a sample of that powder so they can send it to the lab for testing.
Based on the condition of the body, investigators believe the murder took place a few days earlier.
I don't think the police even know the actual sequence of events. But we believe that Julian died on the Friday and his body was reported on the following Monday, so he'd been lying there all weekend.
Police very quickly put out word to the local community asking for information, anything at all to do with what Julian had done that weekend. But also, had anybody heard anything suspicious?
Police find no signs of a break-in, so they don't think Julian was killed in the course of a robbery.
The workers who discovered the body told the officers they found the door open. That meant that Julian had either opened the door for whoever killed him, or they had a key.
In the days after the murder, Julian's building was crawling with forensic officers who were trying to find evidence for who might have done this.
They were looking for the weapon, but they never found it. The knife has never been found.
However, it appears the killer did take one of Julian's belongings.
Mr. Aubrey's watch was missing when his body was found.
It's another strange detail in a very strange murder. Who knocks on someone's door, stabs them to death, and then takes their wristwatch but nothing else?
After several days, police still don't have a lead on the killer, but they do uncover some surprising news about the victim.
Julian was taking such harsh drugs like crystal meths. I was very saddened.
Crystal meth or methamphetamine can drastically alter behaviour. So initially it might cause euphoria, but it can lead to paranoia and aggressive, violent behaviours.
It just distorts your brain. Quite a harsh drug. It has devastating consequences.
According to those who knew him, Julian's drug use had transformed him from a loving caretaker into an emotionally unstable addict.
The Julian that was living then wasn't the Julian that I'd known or seen up to a year previous to that. He was always good fun, intelligent, but he just changed.
Detectives spoke to neighbours in the block where Julian lived, who told them that there had been some problems between Julian and other people who lived in the flats.
Standard neighbourly disputes over noise, problems with waste, the normal disputes that one would have with a neighbour.
And in the months before his death, Julian's outbursts had escalated.
He'd been accused of leaving furniture in communal hallways, at one point even throwing stuff out of his window, and generally just antagonising other people in the block.
A neighbor told police that Julian had become so volatile that they were actually concerned he may hurt somebody.
Investigators discover there was one resident in particular who seemed to bear the brunt of Julian's drug-fueled outbursts on a regular basis. 48-year-old Enrique Facelli.
Enrique Facelli lived opposite Julian.
But now everyone is saying that he and Julian were constantly butting heads.
Investigators knew that drugs contributed to Julian's combative behavior towards his neighbor, but it seemed Enrique Facelli was equally hot-headed.
Police had been called on a number of occasions to deal with conflicts between Mr. Aubrey and Mr. Facelli, and we've later learned that some of those were quite serious.
Did Julian's neighbor decide to end their feud once and for all?
It turned out Enrique was actually the one who'd found Julian's body, but he didn't call police. Instead, he told the two workmen who wound up reporting it.
He said he'd found him. He'd found the door open and that he'd seen Julian lying on the floor, and said he went downstairs to tell someone.
Coming up, investigators find out their victim might actually be an attempted murderer.
Julian was even trying to poison him with noxious substances.
He was terrified, and he actually slept with a knife under his pillow for protection.
After several days of investigation, West Kensington police have finally come up with a suspect in the brutal stabbing of 55-year-old Julian Aubrey.
It seemed as if Julian's drug addiction and increasingly aggressive behavior toward his neighbors was reaching a boiling point, and perhaps someone decided to get rid of him.
That neighbour was identified as Enrique Faselli. He was 48, and like Julian, he was a long-term resident of the building.
The feud between Julian and Enrique had apparently been going on for a couple of years, but detectives learned that the two hadn't always been enemies.
Up until 2015, there'd been no real indication of any animosity between them. They, by all accounts, were quite neighbourly towards each other, and no indication of any kind of problems.
I believe they were friends for about 20 years, living next door to one another.
A background check reveals Enrique Faselli to be a long-standing member of London's Uruguayan community. He'd emigrated to the city in the 1990s.
Enrique grew up in Punta del Este. It's a small tourist town on the coast of Uruguay.
I spoke to a colleague in South America who has very good Uruguayan ties. She quickly found out that he was very popular among high society, particularly in Punta del Este, where the rich and famous tend to holiday. He had lots of wealthy connections.
Enrique worked for the Uruguayan embassy in London, focusing on tourism and media relations.
Faselli had had a successful career in the diplomatic corps. He'd been the cultural attaché for 18 years.
He used this role for prominence, if you like, social prominence. He was quite respected in his own way.
His social circle included more than just diplomats, however. Enrique was also a prominent figure in London's gay community.
He was a highly educated and very sophisticated and cultured man.
They lived in the same apartment building in West Kensington, and that's how Enrique and Julian became friends. They were culturally very different, but in fact, they had a lot in common.
But Enrique's life had suddenly taken a turn for the worse in 2013, when he lost his job after nearly 2 decades.
At the time of the murder, Faselli wasn't working. He'd recently been discharged.
We didn't get all of the detail, but we were told by multiple sources that he'd left under a cloud and that there'd been some difficulty around his behaviour when he left the Uruguayan embassy.
In the 2 years following his firing, Enrique and Julian's relationship had also fallen apart.
It seems that in 2015, the neighbourly spirit between the two broke down as they started antagonising each other.
I don't know what contributed to that. I don't know whether it was just a natural deterioration of the friendship or whether something specific happened.
Knowing what they do about Julian's drug abuse, the assumption at that point has to be that it contributed to their falling out.
In 2015, Enrique made a series of phone calls to police and the building's housing association.
Faselli was making claims about Julian, about him causing trouble, about arguments between them.
Faselli had made numerous complaints about Julian, saying that he was making noise in the middle of the night, he was opening his mailbox, leaving trash in communal areas, and also, bizarrely, that he was leaving excrement out, hopefully, so that Faselli's dog would get the blame.
Julian's campaign of harassment seemed to make Enrique an obvious suspect. He had both the motive and the opportunity to commit the murder, so investigators bring him in for questioning.
The first thing they wanted to know is why didn't he report Julian's death? After all, he was the one that found the body. So why not report it?
Mr. Faselli had completely denied any involvement.
Enrique admits to the ongoing feud with Julian, but insists that he wasn't the one to blame for it spiraling out of control.
Enrique made some startling claims. He said Julian was trying to poison him and he suspected Julian was pumping it into their apartment somehow.
Julian apparently put powder in their drain pipes or something. There's no evidence of this. This is just what Faselli said.
Real or not, Enrique seemed terrified of Julian. He even told police he'd been sleeping with a knife under his pillow.
Because he was so scared that Julian was going to climb into his bedroom window at night.
According to Enrique, Julian's behavior had become so erratic that he decided, I'm getting out of this building for a while.
That doesn't necessarily mean Enrique is telling the truth.
The mention of keeping a knife under his pillow immediately stands out because, of course, Julian had been stabbed. It seems that Enrique must have been exaggerating, however, because the police searched his apartment and they couldn't find a knife that matched the one used in the murder. Detectives did collect some other items off Enrique, including some of his clothes and some of his personal effects.
As part of the investigation, police seized Fuseli's watch for forensic testing.
However, the tests would take weeks to complete, and in the meantime, police have no evidence linking Enrique to the crime scene.
At that point, there's no way to contradict his story or make an arrest, so they're forced to let him go. But if he didn't kill Julian, who did?
Coming up, new evidence turns the investigation upside down.
Fuseli had bought caustic soda crystals just 3 days before the murder.
It's a highly corrosive chemical similar to sulfuric acid.
It's been several days since Julian Aubrey was found stabbed to death in his apartment, and detectives are no closer to finding his killer. Their first suspect, Julian's 48-year-old neighbor, Enrique Fuseli, has been released following questioning.
They lived opposite each other for years. They had seemed amicable, but that relationship seemed to sour in recent years.
Enrique was the one who found the body, but he denied having anything to do with the murder, and his story appears to hold up. Police found nothing in Julian's apartment linking Enrique to the crime. No trace evidence like fingerprints, hair, or fibres, and those are things that you'd expect to find if someone had stabbed another person to death.
London police hope Julian's autopsy will help shed some new light on the case.
When the results of the post-mortem came back, police weren't surprised to discover that Julian had died as the result of multiple stab wounds.
The injuries sustained to Julian were pretty horrific, to be honest. Well, my brother's final months must have been terrifying.
To investigators, a stabbing already suggests something about the killer. A knife is much more personal than a gun, but to stab someone 22 times indicates either intense hatred or some kind of psychotic episode.
Of particular interest is the crystallized powder covering Julian's body.
When the medical examiner tested the powder, they found it to be a substance known as caustic soda, which is a really highly corrosive chemical similar to sulfuric acid.
Caustic soda is a cleaning agent that can cause some seriously nasty burns.
Enrique was convinced that Julian was pumping chemical substances through his air ducts. Could it have been that caustic soda?
Detectives search Julian's home looking for more of the substance, but they don't find any. However, they discover Enrique does have a bottle of it in his apartment.
Police decide to dig a little deeper into Enrique, including his financial records, and some of the things he'd bought were very interesting.
Police found records of Mr. Fuseli purchasing caustic soda in the supermarket below their shared block of flats.
Police already know about the chemicals, but what concerns them is when Enrique bought the soda.
It turned out that Fuseli had bought caustic soda crystals just 3 days before the murder.
The timing suggests premeditation because, after all, if you're going to kill someone, what better way than using industrial strength cleaner to get rid of the evidence?
That wasn't the only strange thing he'd bought. Enrique had made a number of purchases over the last several months, and they all painted a picture of someone who was convinced someone was trying to kill him.
Investigators discover Enrique had also invested in a forensic report aimed at detecting bugging devices. But that was only the beginning.
Mr. Fuseli had paid for the flat to be swept for listening devices. He'd spent a fortune on rented apartments outside of London to get away from Mr. Aubrey. To him, the threat from his neighbor was very real.
Is it evidence that Enrique was planning to murder his neighbor? Or does it prove that everything he told police is true?
It's suspicious that he'd buy cleaning supplies just before Julian was murdered, but everything else supports Enrique's story about how afraid he was. That Julian was this dangerous drug addict with a vendetta against him. Not everyone felt that way about him, though. Some neighbours had complained, but as police took a closer look at those complaints, they seemed fairly mundane.
The question is, if Julian was so unhinged, if Julian was so potentially dangerous, why didn't anyone file a police report? Why didn't anybody try to get a restraining order?
They couldn't prove anything one way or the other. But a lot of what Enrique was saying just didn't make sense. Poisoning someone through their air ducts, bugging someone with surveillance equipment, that doesn't sound like something your drug-addicted neighbour would do. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
Coming up, investigators get a closer look into a disturbed mind.
Fuseli was convinced that Julian was a member of a satanic cult.
He bashed the door down with an axe.
It's February of 2018, 3 months after the murder of Julian Aubrey, and there are still no charges in connection with the crime. However, investigators are still looking into Julian's former friend and neighbor, Enrique Fuseli.
Police were initially told that the bad blood between them started with Julian's escalating drug addiction.
Enrique claimed Julian's drug abuse made him fear for his life. But investigators discover Enrique was also battling some demons of his own.
It turns out the reason Enrique lost his job at the embassy was that he'd suffered a mental breakdown and spent several weeks in a psychiatric hospital.
We've got somebody who's had a very high-level job. He's intelligent, he's well thought of in his community, but still, he's struggling. He's struggling with his mental health problems.
After his hospitalization, Enrique's mental state only got worse.
He quickly descended into paranoia and hallucinations, most of them centered around Julian. And it wasn't just that he was trying to poison him.
Fuseli's allegations towards Julian were actually just products of a tortured imagination. They were completely fabricated.
But Enrique's fears were all too real to him.
Mr. Aubrey clearly upset Mr. Fuseli, and Mr. Fuseli's mental illness worsened to the extent that he became violent.
In 2016, there was a forced entry from Fuseli into Julian's flat.
He bashed the door down with an axe and terrified Julian, and Julian must have been absolutely scared for his life.
Here's a situation that's very clearly becoming out of control. There's a very clear indicator here for ongoing risk.
He was arrested and obviously seen by a mental health team.
After the incident, Enrique had been readmitted to the psychiatric hospital for evaluation.
The housing association, which ran the block of flats, noted that Fuseli had been displaying signs of extreme paranoia and delusions, which are thought to have continued until July 2017, where he was committed to a psychiatric hospital for 28 days.
He was kept for the requisite 28 days and released, deemed to be not to be a threat.
After that time, he was released and went back to living in the block of flats in West Kensington.
He was released after that, free to live next door again.
3 months later, Julian Aubrey was dead.
The fact that Enrique was the one who suffered from mental illness, of course, didn't help his case, but it also didn't prove that he was the one who murdered Julian.
Many people who struggle with mental ill health and have erratic behaviours don't then go on to kill. It's extremely unusual.
Enrique stuck by his claim that he'd never stepped foot inside Julian's apartment the day of the murder. But when the forensic tests are finally completed, the results prove otherwise.
This took weeks to get the results because they had to be absolutely certain that the results were correct.
Those forensic tests demonstrated that Enrique Faselli hadn't just been in the apartment, he'd also been in contact with the body. They know that primarily because of the wristwatch.
While they were investigating the murder, police had taken Faselli's watch, and it was later found to have blood on the strap, and the blood belonged to Julian Aubrey.
The watch also turned out to be Julian's, and the police noticed that it was missing when they were examining his body. So finding Enrique with it again tied him to the crime.
And that's not all they find.
Apart from the caustic soda found on Julian's body, they also found traces of Faselli's DNA.
Those two pieces of evidence completely blow Enrique's story apart. He was in the apartment on the day of the murder, and he was in contact with the victim. And instead of notifying police, he'd taken his watch.
The forensics proved absolutely that it was him. It was definitely him.
A toxicology report also shows that at the time of the murder, Enrique was high on the drug GHB.
GHB is an illegal party drug, sometimes referred to as liquid ecstasy. It can produce euphoria, intense sexual feelings, but it can also provoke hallucinations and blackouts.
With all the evidence they had collected, police now had enough to rearrest Faselli.
On February 28, 2018, Enrique Faselli is once again taken into police custody. This time, he is charged with murder.
They did a great job. Huge respect for forensic science. I think it's amazing.
He pleaded not guilty to the murder of Julian Aubrey, and the case was scheduled to go to trial at the Old Bailey.
The question was whether Enrique was actually mentally fit to stand trial. So the judge ordered Enrique to remain in custody and to undergo psychiatric evaluation.
Enrique Faselli is not a bad man. He's somebody who has clearly started to develop very paranoid beliefs. So he's somebody who's tortured, really. He believes that he's being persecuted, and it feels very, very real to him.
Coming up, will a deranged killer be brought to justice, or will he go free?
The court hearing was a huge surprise.
"48-year-old Enrique Faselli is set to stand trial for the brutal murder of LGBT activist Julian Aubrey. Prosecutors believe he stabbed his neighbor 22 times in retaliation for crimes he never actually committed.
He believed Julian was trying to kill him, so he killed Julian instead.
We were all hoping that Faselli would be convicted of murder.
But the day before the trial starts, there is a surprising development.
Faselli was due to stand trial for murder, but he pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility.
The results of the psychological examination revealed that Enrique was suffering from schizophrenia.
Mr. Faselli was found to have severe mental health problems. That meant that he wasn't fully in charge of his faculties at the time of the murder.
On August 8, 2018, the court hears arguments from both sides to determine Faselli's sentence.
We finally went into the courtroom and all stood for the judge. And then Faselli was brought in. into the dock. He was actually brought in by 5 other people. We only have 2 usually. Maybe that's some indication of how his mental state actually was.
The prosecution concedes that Enrique's psychological issues were a contributing factor.
Mr. Faselli clearly had a long history of mental health difficulties, which the authorities were aware of, and you have to wonder whether the murder might have been avoided had he received the correct treatment.
However, the fact that he attempted to destroy the evidence of his crime implied Enrique knew exactly what he was doing.
Faselli stabbed Julian 22 times, left his body on the floor and smeared caustic soda all over him.
If you're having a psychotic break, do you actually have the sense of mind to clean it up afterwards?
To see Faselli there, who didn't look left or right, just stared straight ahead at the judge all the time. Couldn't get any eye contact. And I actually wondered whether he had any remorse or whether he really appreciated the circumstances he was in.
The defense argues there was no motive behind Enrique's actions.
He was suffering from delusions. He thought Julian was trying to poison him, so maybe, in his twisted mind, it really was some kind of poetic justice.
Was it revenge? Ha! You've been doing this to me, but look what I'm doing to you. Or was it something more?
Enrique's lawyers don't claim he is innocent, but they do ask the court to consider his schizophrenia as a mitigating factor in his sentence.
We've got a normally gentle man who is in a state of absolute torture and distress, and unfortunately, he takes a decision within that distress to take violent action against his neighbour.
To find out a man in his 50s has been murdered by his neighbour because of this bizarre paranoid episode in which he is convinced that there's devil worship afoot, that there's some kind of poison being pumped into his flat, that he's being watched and listened to. It was quite exceptional.
As part of the hearing, Louise Turner gives her own statement, asking the court to give her brother justice.
Although he was obviously ill, I can't help think that he knew what he was doing as well. He must have known. Must have intended to kill him.
At the end of the day, the judge decides to accept Enrique's plea and sentences him to a secure psychiatric facility.
The lasting effect is, quite simply, my brother is gone. The fact that Faselli took my brother's life and has affected me so much, I think, in some ways, he's got off lightly. He still has a life. He's still alive. No more. Julian. And Faselli's still here. So I am angry at that.
The judge, with the agreement of 2 psychiatrists, agreed the best thing to do was to admit Faselli to a mental health institution for the protection of the public.
No time limit given. So we don't know how long he's going to be away for. Could be 5 years. Could be many more years. But when he is released, if he is released, it has to be approved.
Enrique Faselli would no longer pose a threat to his neighbors, but to the friends and family of Julian Aubrey, his death remained a tragedy on many levels.
It's the absolute sadness and sorrow that I feel. It's just so... it could have been avoided.
To have a neighbour who has forced his way into someone's home with an axe and a crowbar, then killed the same person just 2 months later, you have to ask whether the authorities did the right thing by releasing Mr. Faselli after 28 days.
I'll never forget Julian. And, when I'm an old lady, I'll still think about it. I wouldn't wish this on anyone.